You're welcome back for our final hour here. This time we bring you our extra special. And we turn our lenses to a man whose insights often stir the conscience of policy makers. The Emir of Kano and the former central bank governor, His Royal Highness Muhammadu Sanusi II. Now, in an exclusive interview with News Central earlier this week, the Emir made bold remarks about Nigeria's economic direction, from monetary policy to agriculture and fiscal discipline. He commended parts of President Tinubu's reform agenda, saying he supports, quote, 80%, end quote, of what has been done, yet raised alarm over policy inconsistencies, weak coordination between fiscal and monetary policy, and the neglect of agriculture as a driver of inclusive growth.
To explore the issues raised by the Emir, we're joined by two brilliant minds, Professor Kenny Fair, development economist and public policy analyst, and also Dr. Nnaemeka Obiaraeri, investment banking executive and development economist. Gentlemen, welcome to Breakfast Extra.
Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you,
Right.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. I'm going to start with you, Professor Fair, right, and just talk about what your major takeaways from that interview that he gave here at News Central. One of the things he said was that he supports about 80% of President Tinubu's reforms, but also did raise concern about the cabinet and appointments, and saying that our governance is expensive. But that's always been the worry from one administration to the other. But this administration's cabinet seems to be ballooned. Let's talk about that, starting with some of the fiscal disciplines that he mentioned.
I think I would give the government 85%, if not more. I do accept and I respect Sanusi a lot because he's scholarly in his approach, he's very intelligent, he has a lot of experience, and he's bold. He speaks truth to power, so I do really respect. So what he said is correct. We've all agreed that cost of governance is a major consideration, but it is not. It's by far small. It's very small compared to fiscal indiscipline, because fiscal indifference is all that it takes to actually lift this country out of poverty. If we can show more transparency, accountability, and prudence in public finance management. But anyway, there are many other things that he pointed at, and I think at the appropriate time we will unlock those and shed more light on those.
Right. And Doctor, your take on that on the interview. Dr. Obiaraeri? Seem to have lost him there.
Frozen there, yeah.
Now, sir, as we're talking, let's also talk about agriculture. He says that agriculture seems to be left out of the table, and there's a lot of low-hanging fruits as it comes to the agriculture sector. But we know that it's also been bedeviled by insecurity and food insecurity as well. Do you think that the government isn't doing enough regarding that aspect?
Can do more. I've always said that the bold step taken by the president in abolishing subsidy, he only got 50% of the subsidy money. If he had more, he would have done more for agriculture. And if you look at that 50%, he gave a lot of it to governors, plus, of course, the devaluation. And then he ignited Marshall Plan for CNG, and then embarked on quite some infrastructure, and then put a lot of money to poverty reduction efforts. But 50% of the other money of that subsidy was trapped by NNPC in their inefficient operations. So I believe that if he has more resources, he declared a state of emergency on agriculture, but there wasn't much funding to pursue the agenda. And I have to tell you this, I spoke at NESG, I have given several interviews, and I made it very clear that there are two directions Nigeria should consider when you are looking at the wider Africa continental trade. The service sector, trading services, they're okay because they're doing all that they can without support from government. The banking sector is all over Africa. The ICT, we are even the digital leader. There were so many things going for us on the services, and that's what is driving our growth.
Right.
But the trading goods, we have not got goods to export to Africa. Are we going to send them solid mineral, our raw materials? And now the government has brought in 30% value addition, which means industrialization should be at the center of our export-led strategy, growth strategy. And stop all this hemorrhage coming from import dependence. It is import dependency that is making us export raw material and export jobs and import poverty. That is where we have to focus, critical focus, and make sure that fiscal policy addresses industrialization, because it's not. It works against it. And make sure that monetary policy, fiscal policy, all this industrial policy, and investment policy, and trade policy, all of them will converge an employment policy on industrialization so that we can make a serious move to lead this country out of poverty. All this growth we are getting in all the other areas, they are not going to lead, they're not going to create employment. And they're not going to touch or dent the unemployment, the poverty figures. And that was what one of the things he was saying.
Professor Ife, thank you very much. Dr. Obiaraeri is back with us, I'm hoping. Thank you very much, Dr. Obiaraeri. Dr. Obiaraeri, there was so much that the Emir, former CBN governor, that the Emir talked about, and there was very little negative reaction given to the reforms that the Tinubu administration is trying to do. He praised the CBN monetary policy. He lauded the central bank's efforts over the past few years when it comes to mopping up excess cash. He acknowledged that interest rates remain high, but it was a trade-off for restoring stability. He also noted inflation remains elevated, but that it was trending downwards. So these are positive elements that he noted from what the president is trying to do. But how come that is very difficult? It's a very difficult thing to translate that communicatively to the masses. Why are we unable to understand what the presidency is doing when it comes to the reforms for Nigeria?
Let me break it down here. I 100% align with the submissions of the Emir of Kano, SLS, and everything he pointed out, we are spot on. I've always said that Nnaemeka Obiaraeri has been doing a yeoman's job. He's one of the shining lights in this government, and has actually cleaned up the mess in the system. And the policies of the federal government of Nigeria involve fuel subsidy, elimination of the multiple criminal exchange rate regime. We are all spot on. In fact, what Nnaemeka Obiaraeri have actually done is to bring stability in the FX market. There is a relative level of stability within that market. Now, the problem is most of the monetary policy instrument that is adopting is working to ensure price stability, FX stability. But 95% of the problems we have in Nigeria are on the physical side. The governors, the local government chairmen, and those on the Federal Executive Council of Mr. President. And the truth is, this is more than 10 years since our oil output went down from the level of 2.4, 2.8 million barrels. It was in October 2010. 10 years is enough to have instituted massive reforms within that sector to help us ramp up output and ensure that Yemi gets as much forex inflow as his predecessors to enable him continue, using other instruments outside increasing interest rates that will attract only hot money investors. On the agri side, which is one of the most critical factors areas that can actually catalyze growth, all-inclusive growth, eliminate poverty, and put more Nigerians into job. We must also not lose sight of that. It's not the federal government that we should keep most of the focus on. When we talk about agriculture and agro-revolution, a lot needs to be done by the local government and by the states. Yes, we expect the federal government of Nigeria to come by way of providing policies. And one of those policies, and I've said it here, there are 4 factors of production. Land, which is very critical, surface of the land, which is agriculture, underneath it, mineral resources. We have human capital, then we have equipment and machinery, and we have funding. We have 222 million people estimated, over 128 million adult population that are mostly unemployed or underemployed. What I expected the federal government to do by way of policy, we do not produce tractors, we do not produce equipment, we do not produce most of the processing plants. It's to zero tariff. Anybody that can help us bring in this equipment into Nigeria, it will require about $100 to $200 billion to be able to generate this kind of equipment into Nigeria. We need at least 2 million smart farmhouses. We need at least 2 to 3 million tractors and other personal equipment. And this thing can only come by way of private investors. And private investors can only come in if there are policies at the federal government level. Then on the state and local government level, by reason of the Land Use Act, governors control the land. We've advocated in many fora. the adoption of the missions, community diaspora, private-public partnership arrangement in driving agripreneurship. We are not reinventing the wheel. In Italy, you have the Copado model. In East Asia, you see what they are doing. What we expect that the governors working with the private and local government chairmen to create agro clusters, industrial clusters, just like what Michael Akpara did in the old Eastern Nigeria between 1959 to 1966, when he created over 214-kilometer agro-industrial belt. We expected these guys to do the same thing. If we have 2,500 agro clusters across most of the 8,809 electoral wards, each of them occupied by 200 agro rangers, fully trained and equipped. If we invest $6 million in each of these centers, within a space of 1 year, we will generate nothing less than $109 billion in this economy. We will create 20 million jobs, and we will process most of the things we will export out of Nigeria into other African countries. It will shock you. Africa controls 60% of the agricultural land mass, but currently we import $50 billion worth of food, and it's projected by 2030 it will be $130 billion. Nigeria actually sits in the right position to cover the supply deficit in Africa, but most of the focus is on the federal government. We're not looking at the governors. We're not looking at if those on the physical side we do what they're supposed to do, put cost of governance, fix insecurity, stop the oil inefficiencies, reform the oil and gas sector in a way that the NNPC will become as efficient as Petrobras. I tell you of a truth, in the next 2 years, the reform programs of this government, you will see the full manifestation of the advantages. But as long as we refuse to fight corruption headlong, as long as we refuse to restructure the security architecture of Nigeria, to hand over security back to the people, as long as we have refused to do what we are supposed to do by way of adopting these measures, I bet you we will not achieve the gains of those reforms. But kudos to Nnaemeka, and I said to everybody who can listen, today, interest rate is at 30% because NPI is at 27%. And it is so because Yemi is adopting the only available instrument available to him to achieve FX stability. If the physical side can give him $250 million from the non-oil sector, he will reduce interest rate by about 12%. And we will see the gain in the cost of doing business in Nigeria. All
right, Doctor. Let me come to Professor Ife now. Professor Ife, the Emir also noted that Nigeria's GDP is slowly outpacing population growth, which is a good thing, although he says this is from a very slow base. But how would we be able to distinguish between statistical recovery and real felt recovery when it comes to people's pockets?
We've done well on the GDP front by having 4.23% growth rate. But it is not the GDP growth rate compared to the population that matters. Population growth, it is the agricultural output, the growth rate in agriculture. If you remember, the first quarter, it was 0.07. Now, in this quarter, it moved to 2.82 because of harvest activities going on. But that is still less than the population growth rate, which is 3%. And the urbanization rate is 4.6%. So we're still not out of the woods at all. It's a seasonal variation. The alarm was in the first quarter. And next quarter now, you are going to see that it's going to go down, because you are going to be moving to a season where we are now going to be consuming and then also holding materials out for planting. So it is not uhuru yet on agriculture. Is still a big disappointment because of food insecurity. But generally, the only good thing that I also found was that industry, for the first time and for a long time, is giving a growth of 7.45%. The industry case is also as pathetic as the agricultural case. And that's why I said if we really want to seize the opportunity of Africa first, Nigeria first, and the 30% value addition law, and then the opportunities in Africa, continental free trade, we have to critically focus on the biggest impediment to growth and employment and poverty reduction in Nigeria, which is our import dependency. Import dependency means we are importing literally everything. And then the fiscal side is compliant, is the colludes in this, because they are the ones that give licenses for people to import, allow people to import. Look at 2 million jobs went in textile industry. And you go to Kano, Kaduna, and Lagos, you have industrial graveyards, textile industries. And then you see what happened to tire. We are manufacturing tires. See all the things we are manufacturing has vanished. We are importing everything. And same importation culture went into oil and gas to nearly destroy, to bring this economy to their knees, where you are exporting crude and importing everything called fuel, and 4 refineries of NNPC is dead and comatose, and nobody's saying anything. What you now have are Nupeng and all these other people parading themselves as champions of logistics and trying to destroy a $20 billion private sector investment. So these are issues we have to deal with, and that is the reason why this growth that we are posting do not have any connect with poverty reduction. They don't have any connect with growth and population. What I call it, employment. And if you don't have employment, the insecurity will persist. And I can give you an example. If you want to talk about employment, can you just look at 42 million MSMEs in Nigeria, out of 90 million in Africa, 48%. When your GDP is only 16% of Africa GDP and your population is only 15%, but you are powering at 3 times more on entrepreneurship. Why don't you turn to the 42 million and say, look, tell me what you need from this government, both federal and state, for you to create one job, so that you can be looking in the next 5 years, 42 million jobs from 42 million companies. Pilot it in Lagos or wherever else with only 100,000 and you see results. So, this is not rocket science. But they rather do contracts to go and clean gutter and all of that, all kinds of things and whatever, and they don't give you sustainable job, and you cannot reduce poverty sustainably. Those are the challenges. You've got to come to the frontiers of industrialization and get all the macroeconomic policies to point at industrialization.
Now, the CBN governor, former CBN governor, and the Emir of Kano, he advocated for improving the quality of government spending, and he said that we need to ensure that those funds are allocated to areas that provide value and contribute to economic growth. Because he said not doing that would lead us to face fiscal challenges and potentially lead to increased borrowing despite savings from other reforms like subsidy removal. And we talked, and that's one of the things that Mr. Obiaraeri raised on fiscal challenges that the country might face. But let's talk about this in depth. And you said you were going to circle back to it in terms of government spending and the cost of our governance, but most importantly, transparency and implementation on spending. Is this government doing enough? Can they heed this advocacy and recommendations by the former CBN governor? Professor.
Okay, look, let me be a bit more brutal on fiscal side. You see, government, the current statistics show that we actually improved considerably on debt to GDP ratio, dropping down to 39% from 40%. And then also all other ratios are positive, but they don't lead to job creation. The reason is this. We have an extant law of fiscal responsibility at 2007 that tells you why government should borrow and what it should borrow for, what is not eligible and how it should conduct itself, and how to be transparent, accountable, and prudent in the management of public finance. The law says that. Now, you can borrow more because we have headrooms, but you don't borrow money outside the framework of the law. The law says you can borrow for concessionary rates, which is usually under 3%, for long term, which is usually 10 to 30 years, and then you must carry out cost-benefit analysis. It says you have to borrow for capital expenditure and human resource development. So do more on human resource development. They are doing something on ICT. But do more. And capital and human resources, health, education, employment, and self-employment. Whereas capital is infrastructure and investment in productive capacity. Anything that can produce and be capable of yielding. So why the law is very particular about cost-benefit analysis is because it wants you don't borrow money to spend on frivolous infrastructure that leads to no man's land. Use your own money. You raised in September, you earned 36 trillion. Go and use it to do anything you want to do. Build all the roads and things to villages, wherever you want to do. Share the money to, and in fact, you should do more for poor people. Give them more, but you use your money. Don't go and borrow money. And I keep saying that to World Bank. And in their report, a few days ago, they acknowledged that you should not borrow money to distribute. You don't use it to pay for capital expenditure, for recurrent expenditure. So the problem is this. When the law says, I want cost-benefit analysis, which you have refused to produce over the last 10 years, right, what the law is saying to you, when you want to do this infrastructure, consider economic corridors, industrial corridors, commercial corridors, population density, population corridor, so that the infrastructure will go through them and create and support economic activity, which will in turn raise the money to maintain it. So that is the law. And then the law turned around and warned development finance institutions, see, any lending that is outside this framework is unlawful. So they go and obtain certificate of compliance. Okay. You don't get it from FRC, you get it from DMO, and that is not correct. Right, so you can't borrow money without looking at the law that guides that borrowing. Right, so Professor, as I said, let me summarize. Government can borrow more money. They are doing a great job. They should be fiscally responsible. That's the point.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you very much, sir. Very quickly, as we wrap up, I want to ask about tax reforms, and I want to ask Doctor for those tax reforms very quickly. He hailed the tax reforms and said that it would have low burden. That the reforms are important when it comes to mopping up revenue for the country. But there's also been concerns about compliance, implementation, but also taxation that we have seen at the local level with the informal sector. Your take on this, Doctor?
Why is this government so fixated with tax reforms without focusing on fiscal and governance reforms that will help us to unlock productivity in Nigeria, that will enable us to have even citizens that we can tax to raise revenue? You know, I was so shocked when I listened to the tax consultants for the federal government when he said, oh, the new tax reform, under the new tax reform, 90% of Nigerians will not pay tax. It is shocking because we know and realize that over 197 million Nigerians are actually within the World Bank poverty threshold of $64.50 per month net income, which is $100,000, 100,000 naira. Now, does it not shock us also? Look at Singapore, 5.6 million people. Singapore tax revenue in a year is twice more than the whole general revenue of Nigeria. Look at South Africa. South Africa's earning $126 billion, out of it $84 billion tax revenue, mostly from 60 million people. Their capital market is $1.3 trillion dollars debt. Pension fund assets in South Africa is about $175 billion. Nigeria is less than $33 billion. Are we not worried that we are only focused on who are we even going to tax? Is it the 197 million poor Nigerians? What we should be thinking about, just like what is constitutional and fiscal reforms that reduce the cost. I pointed out to you, look at budget report. Budget report said clearly, out of the 40-something trillion that the federal government, out of the budget of federal government put in 25, they discovered over 7 trillion naira that were inserted fictitiously. And we all know in Nigeria today that 60% of everything in the budget are actually looted and stolen through either over invoicing or criminal games in the ministries, department of agencies. The EFCC chairman Olukoyede stated that between 2020, 2021, 2022, that over 2.3 trillion naira were stolen out of the federal government budget through over invoicing. So what we should be thinking about, how do we carry out a constitutional and fiscal reform that reduces the cost of governance, allows us to deploy our critical resources to areas that can catalyze productivity and employment? Look at National Assembly. They allocated 343 billion naira to themselves, 1.26% of our budget. Look at the US, where we've claimed we have borrowed our democracy, the business from. US budget, federal budget was about $6.9 trillion. The only amount allocated to the National Assembly, both upper and lower chamber, was $3 billion, 0.0048%. If we are to apply the same rates, National Assembly should not collect anything less than 25 billion as their total allocation for the year. We need to carry out massive constitutional and fiscal reforms in such a way that governance will become part-time. When you make governance part-time, when you tie this resource, the emolument and best of office of public office holders to that of civil servants, when the president knows, or the governor knows, or the minister knows, or the commissioner knows he cannot earn more than a professor in university, and that there is no more room for them to kick in and kick out and steal from the federal government, most of them will stay away from politics, and those with capacity, with competence, with integrity will find their way into politics, just like we had in the First Republic. But as long as we have refused to do the right things, placing the cart before the horse, I can tell you, yes, they've put everything, they have tax reform been able to eliminate, it will not eliminate anything. I give you an example. We are massively into agriculture. You go to buy raw materials from the north. By the time you cross Benue and enter Nsukka, from Nsukka to Owerri, you will see more than 58 checkpoints. all manner of extortionist checkpoints, from police, from army, from navy, from local government agents, with all manner of flyers and everything. How is the tax reform going to stop this extortion from both uniform and non-uniform agents? These are the kind of things we should be talking about. I kid you not. If we're able to bring in the right discipline, if we're able to carry out massive electoral reform, massive constitutional reform, massive fiscal reform, if our resource control in such a way that the regions or the states will control 50% of what they produce, 30% to the center, 20% to the federal government, reduce the activities at the federal exclusive list to just what it used to be between 1960 and 1966. I tell you of the truth, this country will move forward.
Okay,
but
then,
as long as we continue to run this kind of Babiala Republic, where everybody gathers in Abuja, nobody looks inward to see how they can develop the latent potentials in their regions and their states, this country will not move forward.
Right.
I'm sorry to say this.
All right, then, Doctor.
I must say, Bambiala, did you say Bambiala reforms? Is that what you said?
He did, yeah.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for coming on. Dr. Nnaemeka Obiaraeri, who's an investment banking executive, and also not to forget our very own Professor Kenife, who is an economist, help me there, as well as a public policy analyst. There we go. I got my words twisted. Thank you, gentlemen, for coming on and just giving us big insights on this. And we do hope that this conversation continues when it comes to reforms and to Tinubunomics and the future of our nation. Thank you once again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you. And thank you, Doctor. Thank you.